Super columns for the Super Nintendo Entertainment. Oh wait, sorry, force of habit. Super columns for the Sega Game Gear. It's like columns, but super. Sorry, that's all I got. Columns, for those unfamiliar, was Sega's own signature puzzle series conceived to counter the Russian nightmare known as Tetris, where instead of clearing lines of blocks, you're clearing away columns, rows, and diagonals of 3 or more gems of a kind. The gimmick, as it were, is that you only have columns of 3 gems that you could shift around, but that's about it. It's not quite as popular or as interesting as some of the other puzzle games out there, which is probably why they don't make them anymore. But it's a decent time killer if nothing else. The original Columns was initially ported over to the Sega Genesis, the Master System, and was even a pack-in game for the Game Gear. Somewhere along the way, 1995 to be precise, the Game Gear got its own unique entry called Super Columns. Basically, it's the same old Columns game you've already played, except this time they added the ability to rotate your columns of 3 into a row of 3. What sorcery is this? What could they possibly come up with next? Adding a 4th gem and shooting out columns of varying shapes and sizes? You silly people. Of course not, then it wouldn't be called Columns, it'd be called something else. And then it would infringe on someone else's copyright. So yeah, it's the same old Columns game you've already played, but with an added rotation ability, because people were apparently clamoring for that kind of functionality in a Columns video game, so much so that it was never used again in future Columns games. Both of them. But I digress. In any event, in case you didn't catch it the first couple of times, Super Columns is your usual brand of columns, but they added some additional gimmicky gems that affects the board in certain ways. There's one that, you have your usual columns that clears a certain kind of gem, and then there's one that flips the board around. But of course, there's the new ability to rotate your columns to the side. A regular feature in other similar puzzle games such as Tetris, Dr. Mario, Puyo Puyo, name a couple. Why this was introduced into the columns formula, I don't know. I'm the wrong guy to ask. I suppose to make the columns experience more like those other games, but I never really found much use for this feature, and as such, with rare instances being the exception, I hardly rotate my columns into rows. Which explains my sucking at the story mode. Yeah, in addition to your usual endless marathon mode, and your flash mode, and your versus modes via Gear Link or whatever it's called, there's a story mode, which is you versus the computer, where performing chains puts pressure on your opponent, and the first person to top out loses. It's like a versus mode, but with the computer sort of thing. It's nothing special really, but it is pretty cool to see 2-player action on the same Game Gear display. Not many portable puzzlers of the time pull that off. Of course, there's always the traditional endless mode, which is your marathon mode, and your flash mode where the goal is to clear the flashing gem, and once you do that you move on to the next stage, which is a bit different from Columns previously because that was just one round and you were done. So, yeah. But going back to the core gameplay, aside from a few additional gimmicks like magic columns and rotate buttons, it's still pretty much the same old Columns gameplay, and one could play this the same way they could regular Columns. The ability to rotate your column is something that could help in a pinch, but you could easily ignore the feature and play without it if desired. Unfortunately, you're stuck with the extra gimmicks, there's no way to turn those off. So if you hate gimmicks in your columns, just stick with regular columns. Not much help there. If it weren't for the different backdrops and additional gimmicks on display, Super Columns would essentially be a dead ringer visually for Columns on Game Gear, since it's pretty much the same layout. Playfield in the middle, gems roughly the same size, not much to say there. Various backdrops are well rendered and the playfield is clear and non-intrusive, so even people whose Game Gears boast failing screens shouldn't have an issue with this one. Like the previous game, you could change the appearance of the gems so that they look like blocks or fruit or whatever the case may be. Super Columns keeps some of the older sound effects from the previous game. I could recognize 1 or 2 sounds from the Game Gear and Master System versions of the first Columns game, but there's also a bunch of new sounds that sound okay. Not the best quality sound effects, but within the realm of Game Gear and Master System sound range, it's okay. Super Columns does boast a number of new musical compositions, of which you could choose from a bunch. These are some good tunes, maintaining the overall tonality of the previous Columns tunes, and they also fit the whole overall Arabic theme that these games boast. Good stuff. Overall, Super Columns is columns with a new coat of paint and a rotation button. Hardly elements to justify the Super label, but I guess calling it columns and rows doesn't sound as catchy. Still, it's the same tried and tested Columns gameplay with a couple bells and whistles added for good measure, and it still plays about as good as the last Columns game on Game Gear, so if you come across a copy of this for real cheap, and you enjoy a healthy dose of Columns, then Super Columns might keep you entertained for a while. Unfortunately, Super Columns would be the final new game in the Columns series to grace a Sega console, as the world later decided it would rather play with beans than with gems. Oh well. It was nice while it lasted.